talks between governments in Africa. The pandemic is expected to cost Africa up to $79 billion in lost economic output this year alone, with the additional risk of millions of job losses. How are regional countries prepared to drive trade in the midst of this pandemic? Join our discussion as we unpack the key issues around movement of goods and services around the region. To be part of this debate, join us, and of course you can tweet us at KTN News KE. You can also tweet me at Agina Abi, and our hashtag for this conversation is KTN News Special. I'll be having a very rich, diversified set of guests joining us from multiple locations, including Lusaka, Zambia. But first, let's start with our main guest for this conversation. We have Betty Maina, who is the Cabinet Secretary, the Ministry of Industrialization, Trade, Industry and Enterprise Development, a seasoned professional with over 15 years of experience in organizational leadership and development, engaged in policy analysis and influence. Previously, she served as the Principal Secretary for Environment and also served as the Kenya Association of Manufacturers Chief Executive Officer. Next off, we have Dr. Christopher Onyango, who has actually a doctorate in economics from the University of Nairobi here in Kenya. He was previously the Deputy Director and Head of Trade and Foreign Policy Department at the Kenya Institute for Public Policy Research and Analysis, KIPRA, here in Nairobi. He has an expertise in international trade, regional economic integration, trade in services, and econometric analysis. He also has skills in computable general equilibrium modeling and other trade policy modeling tools. Thank you so much. Next off, we have Mr. Sylvester Kasuku. Kasuku is the Director General of the LAPSSET Corridor and has enormous expertise in transport, logistics, infrastructure, and services management policy, which he has gained for over 20 years. Between 2003 and 2008, Mr. Kasuku was hired by the government of Kenya as a consultant technical advisor with the assistance of the World Bank to steer the Kenya road sector, institutional and legal reform. He has since 2002 been a consultant for the World Bank infrastructure projects in Kenya and Tanzania. And last but not least, our last guest is Phyllis Wakiaga. She is the Chief Executive Officer of the Kenya Association of Manufacturers, which draws a membership base of over 1,000 members. She is an advocate of the High Court of Kenya. Wakiaga also represents KAM on various boards and chairs the Kenya Water Industrial Alliance. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us for this discussion. Before we start, I'd like us to play a clip that paints a picture for us in terms of how has trade been in the East African region and, of course, outside Africa. Nokip Kimboi has more.
Africa is set to commence trading under the Africa Continental Free Trade Area on July 1st, 2020. It will be the largest trading bloc in the world, uniting 1.3 billion people and creating a $3.4 trillion economic bloc. Even with this development, Kenya is struggling to create more exports than imports within the continent. In the 6 months to June 2019, Kenya imported 107.71 billion shillings worth of goods compared to exports worth 107.55 billion shillings. The deficit stands at 156 million shillings. Uganda, which is Kenya's biggest single market, has been striving to import less, its orders from Nairobi dropping to 30.77 billion shillings. From the Kenyan side, though, imports from Uganda almost doubled to 13.95 billion shillings in 5 years. Kenyan goods are less competitive in the international market, this being attributed to high cost of production. A study conducted by CIPRO showed that Kenyan companies cannot compete favorably on a global scale due to insufficient skills of the workforce and failure to embrace technology. Nokip Kimboi, KTN Business.
Thank you so much, Noah, for setting the scene for us. And we want to get into a discussion right now. And let me bring in Madam Betty Maina, the Cabinet Secretary in charge of Trade. And thank you once again for making time for us, CS Minor. And my first question goes to you. And it's basically around how has the country coped so far with the disruptions that COVID has brought about to the economy? And is there hope at the end of the tunnel?
Thank you very much, Abby, and thank you for the invitation to join in this meeting, in this press conference or press discussion today. COVID has been with us formally since March when we discovered the first case, so we're basically going into 5 months of the same. We have got more than 17,000 Kenyans who have got the disease. But I think you will be aware that we have actually less than 300 people who have succumbed. So in terms of mortality and case fatality, we're still at less than 2%. And I think that shows that Kenya has done quite well in ensuring that we have mitigated the impacts of COVID from the health perspective. From the economic perspective, and I think from the health perspective too, I think what we've had and seen from many of our health, from the cases, is that we've really been subjected to a fairly mild case of the disease. And of those who have died, they have died because of other underlying causes, not directly through COVID alone. And for that, we thank God that we haven't had a very high fatality rate. We're very sorry for the loss of life that the country has experienced. I think the second impact of COVID is obviously the impact on a lot of other economic activities, and that it is in public domain that we've had some fairly great disruptions, especially in the hospitality sector, and especially those which are much more globally connected. But a lot of other businesses have also suffered. The small and medium enterprises have also suffered quite a bit. The sectors that rely on exportation of goods, horticulture, floriculture, textile and apparel, suffered some disruptions at the beginning in March and April, but many of them have actually bounced back. Once the markets, external markets opened up, they were able to restart operations. So we haven't had very severe consequences in those sectors.
Thank you.
The education sector and other services sector have suffered quite a bit, and I think that's also in public domain. So it's been mixed. It's been, from the health side, we are glad that we've managed to contain the spread, or at least minimize the spike of the spread, but it has had economic consequences all around.
All right. Thank you, Madam CS. And let me bring in Dr. Christopher Onyango from Lusaka, Zambia. Well, a lot has happened in the member states, as CS has pointed out. There's been, some of the borders were closed earlier on. And how has this impacted on trade from your end of things when you look at the data coming in, especially for Mombasa region?
Thank you, Abby, again for inviting me to this discussion. As you rightly put it, the impact has been felt in terms of the slowdown in intra or cross-border trade within the region. And this is as a result of the measures that member states put in place to contain the spread of the virus across. And therefore, in terms of trade, the figures are still coming in. But so far, you are talking about 30 to 40% of intra-Mombasa trade, particularly, at the border points. So it's been a problem at the regional level as much as it is at the national level.
All right.
And yes, thank you.
Thank you. And let me now bring in Madam Wakiaga. For manufacturers, it has been truly a turbulent time even as some of the manufacturers have had to perhaps shut down operations, even as they try to stick to the containment measures. And it would be interesting to hear from you. What's your assessment so far of the manufacturers, and how has this impacted on trade? All right, we are fixing your microphone.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Please proceed.
Okay. Thank you, Abby. I'm saying that the COVID-19 has had an impact on the manufacturing sector, and Africa as a continent, I think, has been confronted with a double supply and demand shock. At the beginning of the COVID-19 in March, we did see diminished stock because at that time there was limited movement of goods out of China, and that impacted on the manufacturing sector, and people were unable to fulfill client orders at that time. And we then saw one of our big markets, the AGOA market, getting shut down because of what was happening in America. And that led also to the cancellation of a number of orders at that point.
Yes.
Locally, though, we saw still a demand for essential goods because a lot of essential goods are produced locally. But there was still subdued demand because of the lack of cash flow in a lot of people's business. And now you're seeing also the issue of people not having jobs in a number of cases. So that has subdued the demand in the market. We did carry out a survey with KPMG last month. And one of the things that was clear was that about 76% of our members said they were facing difficulties in local sourcing or importing raw materials. And almost 67% found access to markets a challenge. So those are some of the initial statistics coming out of the manufacturing sector around COVID.
Right.
Still a challenging time with subdued demand. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Okiaga. And let me bring in Mr. Kasuku. And it's a very interesting time, of course, listening to the other panelists, and a lot of concern around how the economy will be able to take this on. And for you, of course, being in the sea transportation, with the LAPSET being one of our largest projects in East and Central Africa, just walk us through so far, how has this impacted on trade? You have a very significant project you are doing in Lamu. Has it faced any headwinds?
Thank you very much, Abby. First of all, I wish to note that logistics business was greatly, or has been greatly hampered by the coronavirus pandemic. And this occurred as a result of the disease affecting a number of operational areas, including ports, including a number of companies that are working in the sector, as well as businesses that are operating in the maritime sector. So this has seen or has caused a slowdown in letting goods flow freely. And we've seen even in terms of logistics, just passing borders became among the first casualties when we could not even have trucks moving across borders. So this has hampered movement of goods. It has hampered, it was also hampered by movement of people that became a problem, particularly when we were trying to contain the spread of the virus. At the same time, we've also seen that the supply chain has affected a number of activities within the region, not just in the region alone, but globally. When industries shut down, and as already observed by CAM, that when the industries shut down, for example, in China, and then even the production systems that was to supply a number of markets also got affected. As we speak today, there are a number of goods that are not, that cannot be sourced easily within the region because the supply chain that was linking the market and the industries got affected a great deal. Coming to the project, definitely we know that our construction works are still ongoing, thanks to the early mitigation measures that were undertaken by the government.
All right.
We did realize that when the disease first struck in the country and containment measures were announced, the construction site at Lamu Port was still COVID-free. So there was no need of waiting for COVID cases to be reported there, occasioned by movement of those people who could have transmitted the disease. So we decided to lock the site.
All right.
So that it was only the workers there who were allowed to move within that site.
Okay.
Any other persons coming from outside that site were not allowed to get in. And if anybody needed to get out of that site, then they were not allowed to get back in until the situation is manageable. And that has enabled us to progress the construction works of the port.
Okay.
And so far, we have not reported any case of COVID-19 infections at Lamu Port. Okay. The other aspect that has affected trade and logistics is the grounding of movement through air transport. Business people who have been moving around the globe, doing sourcing and trading across the globe, were brought to a standstill, even though cargo aircrafts are still moving. But the efficiency with which sourcing was done, with which transportation was done, and with which trading was done has been greatly hampered. And this has affected global trade and logistics.
Thank you, Mr. Kasuku, for shedding some very important points. And let's move the conversation forward. And I'd like to take a question to CS Betty Maina. When we look at some of these issues that have confronted us as a country, what sort of protocols have we developed that can ensure easy movement of goods and services? And the same question, I'd also want to hear what Dr. Christopher has to say, but Madam Betty, please go first.
Thank you very much. I think one of the things you will all recall is that Kenya has tried very hard moving within the country and also within the region. Part of the reason for this is we recognize...
All right, we'll be fixing that connection to CS Maina in a short while. Let me take it to Dr. Christopher. Just walk us through some of the rules and regulations that as COMESA you've come up with, and have you been able to sensitize and ensure that there's uniformity among the member states?
Thank you, Abby, for that question. As COMESA, once we realized the threat that regional trade came to face based on what was happening elsewhere, we developed guidelines to facilitate movements of goods and services across the region. And the primary objective of this was to rally member states to be able to apply common or uniform standards when, taking measures, preventive measures to contain the spread of the virus, but at the same time, be able to facilitate a free flow of goods and services across borders. So these guidelines, with the support of the member states, were actually adopted by the Council. And CS Betty was a participant of that, really facilitated the adoption of those guidelines.
Yes.
Around, I think, 14th of May this year. The other purpose of these guidelines was to ensure that the gains that had already been put in place or made within the COMESA agreement were not eroded because of the restrictive measures that member states had put in place, which were justified given the circumstances. And another important aspect which we're looking at is how to facilitate or to enable member states to be able to produce locally and trade locally. This was like a wake-up call that as much as we have those external markets, our own markets around here are important. And so that's why immediately after adoption of those guidelines, one could see an increase in the intra-COMESA trade countries sourcing for materials, whether they're essential or not, from among the member states. So that was a major thing. There are a number of things that are in those guidelines. Yes. And so far, so good. I think we have had positive responses from the private sector. Yeah. That countries are beginning to talk to each other in terms of application of the those rules and regulations. Also, there is more, greater or better coordination at the border points that customs and other customs agencies are able to coordinate activities in conjunction with the health sector in terms of carrying out testing, screening, and those kinds of things, so that there is some level of increased efficiency as far as clearance of goods are concerned. And again, for instance, in border points, which are, one-stop border points, so activities like having to conduct this screening and other, preventive measures are done at the same, on one side of the border. And also, trying to make sure that the results are actually, are recognized in the other side. All these were measures that were meant to try to unlock the restrictions that were inhibiting free flow of goods and services across member states.
Thank you so much for that very insightful set of information. And let me bring in Madam CS Betty. Can you hear me, CS?
I could hear you all along. I didn't realize you couldn't hear me.
Sorry about that. But please proceed. You were talking to us about the protocols in place, and has this been able to ensure that trade goes on unhampered?
To the best of our abilities, we have maintained open trade during this period, because, as I was mentioning, Kenya is a gateway to many other landlocked countries. So it's been critical to ensure that there was cargo movement within the region, and it's also within Kenya. Even when we had cessation of movement out of Mombasa and Nairobi and some counties, the exception was cargo goods, because you wanted to make sure that the economy and people do not suffer from absence of supplies, because that would have increased prices and further compromised welfare. With regard to the region, so for internal purposes, we developed some practical administrative things, identification for trucks, identification for drivers, and clear stickers that could enable them to move with ease. And I think that's been fairly seamless. For the region, we also developed and agreed, certainly with Uganda and Rwanda, developed on common testing protocols for drivers, because you wanted to make sure you had safe trade. And at the same time, we also introduced electronic tracking of drivers and as well as vehicles. One of the challenges we faced is many of the drivers did not get access to tests at the beginning of their journeys, and many of them were relying on getting the tests at the border, which of course everybody knows they are not instant. So we've had instances where we've had delays at the border, which
Yes.
fortunately that's going down quite a bit. It would be helpful if we had the same, because we were testing using the same protocol. So it was really the question of capacity and infrastructure at the borders to be able to manage large numbers for those who did not test at the beginning of their journeys. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madam CS. And Phyllis, when you hear of the fact that the new normal right now is companies should think of innovative ways of doing productions locally, what does this have to say about us as a country? We heavily import quite a lot of raw materials for different sets of goods. And what are the opportunities that COVID has presented to Kenyan manufacturers, and how can they expand this across the region?
In terms of over-reliance on imports, I think that is something that affects not just Kenya, but COMESA. If you look at our inter-COMESA trade, it's only at about 10%. When you look at how Europe trades amongst the EU, it's over 60%. So it means that a lot of our products are imported, and actually over 50 or 60% of our machinery and industrial inputs is imported into the continent. So for us, what it means is that there's a big opportunity for local sourcing of a lot of these products, and COMESA has a big opportunity to expand local sourcing amongst the partner states. In Kenya, I think one of the things that has really become very clear during the COVID season is the need and the importance to build a local manufacturing sector because of the supply shocks that we've talked about happening globally. Some of the things we require, like say the PPEs locally, are also required globally. So if we didn't have the response we've seen from the local manufacturers to produce, whether it's the face masks, the different gowns and PPE items required, you can imagine the shock we would have in terms of supply of some of these critical products. So for me, what it has demonstrated is the need for us to build strong local manufacturing sectors, not just in Kenya, but within COMESA and Africa, so that we become more reliant on ourselves as a continent, and also the need to start manufacturing a lot of the intermediate products within the continent. So this for us is something that we need to do, and some of the things we need to do is address the cost of doing business. I think when we watched the video clip at the beginning, it did talk about the issue of cost, skills, and technology, so that we are able then to produce these things competitively within the continent. But a big opportunity for all of us.
All right, thank you, Madam Phyllis. And we want to proceed on a quick commercial break. And we want to take time to also pick your views. You can always catch us on our Twitter handle at KTN News KE. You can also tweet me at Agina Abi, and our hashtag is KTN News Special. When we come back, we'll be looking at how do we make African economies more resilient in the midst of such a pandemic. I'll be shooting questions straight to Mr. Sylvester Kasuku, but we'll have this after this quick break.
This is KTN News.
Aerial Guarantee.